He mocked her shoes in front of everyone, not knowing those same worn soles had walked her through storms he'd never survive. But the day she arrived in her own limo, the man who once laughed couldn't even look her in the eye. The meeting room buzzed with laughter, a cruel kind that echoes long after the noise fades. Zanele stood frozen, the files still clutched in her shaking hands. Every pair of eyes in that glass-walled office was on her. Mocking, whispering, amused. Tabo leaned back in his chair with that proud smirk, straightening his expensive tie as if he'd just made a clever joke. But to her, his words weren't a joke. They were a knife wrapped in laughter. She glanced down at her worn brown flats, the ones that had walked her through years of struggle, rain, rejection, and hope. To everyone else they looked cheap, but to her, they were silent witnesses of resilience. The room went quiet for a second when she didn't respond. Some of the newer interns looked uneasy, but no one dared speak. Zanele forced a small, polite smile, placed the documents gently on the table, and stepped back. Her throat burned, her heart pounded, yet her dignity stood firm. She knew if she opened her mouth, the tears she was holding back would escape. So she said nothing. As the meeting continued, every word Tabo said sounded far away. She stared at the city skyline outside the window, tall, proud buildings built by people like her who were never noticed. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The humiliation hurt deeply, but beneath that pain, a quiet fire began to rise. She promised herself silently that one day, this same room would know her worth, not because of her shoes, but because of the power of the woman wearing them. When the meeting ended, she walked out slowly, hearing the whispers trail behind her. She should really dress better. Maybe she can't afford new shoes. Poor thing. Each word stabbed like a needle, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes stronger than words. As she reached her desk, she exhaled softly and ran her fingers across her mother's old locket, the one she wore every day. "Mama," she whispered under her breath, "they laughed again, but I won't let this be my story." And in that quiet promise, humiliation turned into determination, the kind that would soon change everything. Zanele grew up knowing what it meant to be invisible. When she was 16, her mother, who worked as a cleaner in a small clinic, passed away after years of struggling to keep them afloat. That woman had scrubbed floors with cracked hands and tired eyes, but she never complained. She used to tell Zanele, "Dignity isn't about what's on your feet, my child. It's about what's beneath them, strength." Those words became Zanele's armor, something she repeated quietly every time life tried to make her feel small. After her mother's funeral, Zanele promised herself she would rise above the silence the world had placed her in. She would walk into rooms that once shut her out, not to prove she belonged, but to leave a mark they could never erase. But dreams alone didn't make life easier. The corporate world was colder than she'd imagined. The office was filled with polished smiles and expensive perfumes, people who thought kindness was weakness. When Zanele spoke, they barely listened. When she entered a room, they looked past her. They whispered about her worn bag, her old phone, and the same brown flats she wore every day. Yet, while they were busy gossiping, she was busy learning. She studied how deals were made, how contracts were signed, how investors were handled. Every detail, every conversation, she absorbed it like a sponge. She came early before anyone else and stayed long after the lights went out. When others went to lunch in fancy restaurants, she ate her packed food quietly at her desk, writing notes in her small notebook. Her salary was small, but she treated every paycheck like a seed. She divided it carefully, a little for rent, a little for food, and the rest she saved for a dream she never told anyone about. While her colleagues bought the latest phones and designer shoes, she kept collecting knowledge. She believed that someday those small savings and sleepless nights would build something greater than approval. They would build her freedom. People laughed at Zanele, but she didn't mind. Because while they saw a quiet girl with old shoes, she saw a future leader in the making. One the world wasn't ready for yet. Every night after work, when the city lights of Johannesburg flickered like 1,000 restless dreams, Zanele would sit at her small kitchen table with a cup of weak tea and an old laptop that sometimes froze mid-sentence. In the quiet hum of her one-room apartment, she worked on something no one knew about, a secret plan she called the Haven Project. It wasn't just an idea. It was her heart written in blue ink, her vision of building affordable housing for single mothers who had nowhere safe to raise their children. Each page of her worn notebook was filled with sketches of tiny homes, community kitchens, gardens, and shared playgrounds, places filled with laughter, not struggle. She wanted to create a world where women like her late mother would never have to choose between rent and dignity again. While her co-workers spent their nights at parties or bars, Zanele spent hers building dreams out of paper, numbers, and faith. One evening, while she was staying late at the office cleaning up old files, she overheard voices in the next room. Her boss, Thabo, was boasting to a wealthy client over the phone. His voice carried that same arrogance she'd grown used to. "I'm the only one visionary enough to change this city's skyline," he said proudly. Zanele paused, standing quietly behind a stack of boxes. She almost laughed to herself. Yes, she thought, he changes skylines for the rich, but who changes lives for the poor? That question stayed with her like a spark in the dark. When she got home that night, she opened her notebook again. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages filled with her mother's favorite quotes and rough financial plans. At the very bottom of the last page, she wrote a single new line, pressing hard into the paper as if engraving a promise to herself. "They'll know my name when the time is right." From that night forward, her dream no longer felt distant. It felt alive. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about purpose. She didn't need to outshine Thabo's skyline. She just needed to build something that reached hearts, not heights. And deep inside, she knew the time would come. That night at the gala became the moment Zanele would never forget. She had spent all week preparing for it, pressing her only black dress, polishing her old shoes until they almost shone. She wanted to belong, just for once, to feel like she wasn't invisible in that glittering world of rich laughter and diamond smiles. But when she reached the door of the ballroom, Thabo, her manager, blocked her path. His smirk was cruel, the kind that could cut deeper than a knife. "Zanele, this is not a charity event. People like you should watch from the service entrance," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. The guests laughed softly, pretending not to stare, but their eyes said it all. "You don't belong here." Zanele froze. The music behind the door went on playing, the laughter echoing. But in that moment, everything inside her went silent. She felt every word burn like fire under her skin. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry, not there. She turned around, her head down, and walked out into the cold night. The city lights blurred through her tears as she walked home, step after step, her cheap shoes clicking against the pavement like broken promises. When she reached her tiny apartment, she finally let the tears fall. All her hard work, her loyalty, her silent sacrifices, none of it mattered to them. They only saw the girl from nowhere, the one with no connections, no fancy clothes, no family name. For a long time she sat on her narrow bed, staring at the notebook that held her dream, the Haven Project. And then something inside her shifted. The humiliation didn't break her. It lit something fierce inside her chest. She looked in the mirror and whispered to herself, "This ends tonight. No one will ever see me small again." That night she stayed awake until dawn, rewriting her plan, adding new goals, new timelines, new courage. Every insult became fuel. Every tear became ink. She wasn't just dreaming anymore. She was building. The same girl they had mocked for her shoes was now walking a path that none of them could see. But soon the world would. The morning after the gala, Zanele woke up with swollen eyes but a fire that refused to die. The humiliation still echoed in her ears, but this time it didn't hurt. It pushed her forward. She ironed her dress, packed her few belongings from her office drawer into a small box, and walked straight into Vantage Holdings one last time. Her steps were steady. Her heart was loud but sure. As she entered, heads turned. Whispers followed her like shadows. Everyone wanted to see what the girl with the cheap shoes would do next. Thabo, her arrogant boss, leaned back in his chair and sneered. "Leaving already? Going to sell shoes now?" Zanele didn't even flinch. She placed a white envelope on his polished desk, looked him right in the eye and said calmly, "Thank you for everything." Then she walked out. When Thabo opened the envelope, he found her resignation letter, and beneath it, a small handwritten note. Thank you for teaching me what kind of leader I'll never be. Outside that office, the world felt wider. Scary, yes, but hers. For the first time, Zanele wasn't surviving someone else's dream. She was chasing her own. She gathered her savings, every coin she had saved from skipped lunches and long overtime hours, and began applying for small business loans to fund the Haven project. Rejection followed her like rain. One bank said she was too young. Another said her idea was too emotional, not profitable. Some didn't even let her finish her pitch. But every no only sharpened her yes. Late one night, she uploaded a short video about her vision, a place where single mothers could live with dignity, raise their children safely, and rebuild their lives. She didn't expect much, but fate was watching. A few days later, an email arrived from a woman named Nandi Dlamini, a respected entrepreneur and investor. Her message was short. Meet me for coffee tomorrow. I think I've been where you are. At the cafe, Nandi listened quietly as Zanele spoke, her hands trembling but her voice clear. When Zanele finished, Nandi smiled and said, "You remind me of myself. Let's build the Haven together." That was the moment Zanele's dream stopped being a secret and started becoming a movement. Zanele worked like a woman possessed. Days turned into nights, and nights into new beginnings. She had no fancy office, no rich backers, just her worn notebooks, her mother's memory, and a dream too stubborn to die. She walked the dusty streets of Soweto, meeting builders, single mothers, and local craftsmen. Together they began shaping her vision, one brick, one nail, one heartbeat at a time. Instead of waiting for miracles, she created them. She collected recycled materials from construction sites, negotiated with local carpenters for fair wages, and convinced suppliers to donate leftover paint and tiles. Slowly, her idea started to rise from the soil. The Haven Project, a small community of 10 homes built with love, strength, and dignity. When the first house stood finished, Zanele stood in front of it, her hands trembling, eyes wet with disbelief. It wasn't just a building. It was proof that people like her could build something lasting, something that mattered. Word spread quickly. A local journalist visited, curious about the young woman behind the project. A week later, an article appeared with the headline, "The Assistant Who Built Hope." The story exploded. Suddenly, Zanele was being invited to speak at community events. Non-profit groups called her for partnerships. Within months, her inbox flooded with messages from international NGOs offering support. Investors who once ignored her now asked to meet. But even as the world began to notice, Zanele stayed the same. She refused luxury cars or designer shoes. Every site visit, she arrived in her same brown flats, the very shoes they once mocked. She said they reminded her where she came from. The Haven grew faster than anyone expected. In less than a year, it became a registered foundation, spreading across Johannesburg and beyond. Mothers moved into homes they could finally afford. Children laughed in clean, safe courtyards. Zanele often stood at a distance watching them. She didn't see numbers or profits. She saw stories, women who had suffered now smiling again. That was her real success. The girl once laughed at for her shoes was now changing the face of South Africa's housing, one Haven at a time. The fall of Vantage Holdings began quietly, like a storm forming on a clear day. Deals that once came easily started slipping away. Clients who once praised Tabo's charm began questioning his arrogance. His empire, built on pride and polish, began to crack beneath the weight of his own in boardrooms. Whispers grew louder. Tabo's lost his touch, one investor murmured. He's too focused on his image, said another. But Tabo refused to listen. He kept arriving in his tailored suits, convinced success was only one big deal away. Then came the final blow. 3 major contracts pulled out in the same month. The company's reputation was crumbling, and the bank called in its debts. Vantage Holdings was drowning, and Tabo was desperate for a lifeline. He began reaching out to investors across Johannesburg, pitching his new vision for affordable housing, the same idea he once mocked when Zanele believed in it. Investors smiled politely but turned him away, until one day, during a high-profile business forum, an executive leaned forward and said, There's one potential partner who could save your company, the Haven Foundation. They've taken over the entire community housing sector. The name hung in the air like destiny itself. Tabo's heart lifted. Perfect, he said, forcing a grin. Let's arrange a meeting. I'd love to collaborate. The investors nodded, unaware that his hands were trembling slightly beneath the table. The Haven Foundation had become a household name. Respected, admired, powerful. To partner with them could mean redemption for Vantage Holdings. That night, Tabo stayed up researching the Haven Foundation. Articles filled his screen. Headlines like "The Assistant Who Built Hope" and "The Woman Redefining Affordable Housing." He scrolled through photos of smiling families, neat housing estates, and proud mothers holding new keys. But he didn't look closely at the founder's name. He only saw opportunity. Whoever runs this foundation, he muttered to himself, they'll be lucky to work with me. He had no idea that the woman behind the Haven Foundation, the one he'd mocked, humiliated, and laughed at, was about to walk back into his life. But this time she wouldn't be the one standing at his door. He would be standing at hers. The morning was bright, but the air around Vantage Holdings felt heavy. Employees gathered near the windows, curious and restless. A sleek black limousine rolled slowly to a stop right in front of the building, the kind of car none of them had ever seen parked there before. Its tinted windows glimmered in the sunlight, and whispers began to spread through the crowd. Is it a government official? Someone asked. Maybe a foreign investor, another replied. The driver stepped out first, crisp in his suit, and walked around to open the back door. The moment the door opened, silence fell like a curtain. Out stepped a woman, calm, elegant, and powerful. It took the staff only a few seconds to recognize her. Zanele Khumalo, the same woman who once stood in that lobby clutching worn-out files. The same girl they'd mocked for her brown shoes and second-hand dresses. But now she looked like a vision of everything they'd underestimated. Glowing confidence, a soft cream suit, simple jewelry that spoke of quiet power, and yes, those same brown flats. People froze where they stood. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the receptionist, who once looked down on her, could only stare, her mouth slightly open. Tabo Masiko, hearing the commotion, stepped out of his glass office. His heart skipped when he saw her. For a moment he didn't recognize her. She had changed that much. But when she met his eyes and gave that calm, knowing smile, reality hit him like thunder. Zanele, he stuttered, his voice cracking. You're the Haven CEO? Her smile widened, graceful, unhurried, the kind of smile that carried both victory and peace. Yes, she said softly. The one from the bus stop. The words cut through the room like lightning. Every single person who had ever laughed at her felt the sting of shame. Tabo's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. Zanele didn't need to raise her voice or prove anything. Her presence alone spoke louder than revenge ever could. She had walked back into the same building that once broke her spirit, not to seek approval, but to show what grace and resilience could build. The girl they once overlooked had returned, not as an employee, but as the woman who now held their future in her hands. The boardroom was filled with a tense silence that could almost be felt. The long glass table gleamed under the soft lights, and at its head sat Zanele Khumalo, calm, composed, and entirely in control. Around her, a team of well-dressed lawyers reviewed the final pages of a contract that would change everything. Across the table sat Tabo Masiko, the once proud boss who had ruled this office like a king. But today he looked smaller than ever. His suit slightly wrinkled, his confidence drained. The papers in front of him spelled the end of his empire. Vantage Holdings, the company that once mocked a girl for her shoes, was now being signed over to the Haven Foundation, the same foundation Zanele had built from nothing. The very name seemed to echo through the room like a poetic ending. Tabo's hands trembled as he watched her sign the final page. Each stroke of her pen felt like a quiet thunder, sealing his downfall. His throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. All he could do was stare at the woman who had once been invisible to him, now the owner of everything he'd ever worked for. Zanele looked up from the paper, her expression calm but full of quiet power. For a moment their eyes met, his full of disbelief, hers steady and kind, yet unshakably strong. Then, with a soft voice that carried more weight than any shout ever could, she said, "You were right about one thing, Tabo. Shoes do tell a story. Mine just walked me to success." The words hung in the air like truth itself. No anger. No revenge. Just grace. The kind that only comes from surviving pain and turning it into purpose. Zanele stood, gathered her documents, and extended a polite nod to the remaining board members. "Thank you for your time," she said simply. As she walked out, the sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed through the hallway, sharp, confident, final. Each step felt like justice. Each echo reminded everyone in that building that power doesn't always wear designer suits. Sometimes it wears the same old shoes that carried a dream through the dirt, straight into destiny. Months later, the world began to see the full glow of Zanele Khumalo's transformation. The Haven Foundation had become more than just a company. It was a movement spreading across Africa. From the dusty streets of Soweto to the bustling cities of Nairobi and Lagos, construction sites carried the same banner. The Haven Homes of Hope. Everywhere she went, mothers found shelter, children found classrooms, and women found a voice. Zanele walked through one of the new villages one sunny morning, watching children run barefoot through the open courtyards, laughing as their mothers hung colorful laundry in the breeze. These were homes built from dignity, not pity, walls that carried stories of resilience, just like hers. Every brick laid felt like a piece of her past finally finding peace. During the grand opening of a new community center, the air was filled with music, laughter, and hope. Journalists lined up to capture the moment, but what caught Zanele's attention was a little girl, no older than 8, tugging shyly at her sleeve. "Auntie Zanele," the girl asked softly, "how did you become so powerful?" Zanele knelt down to her level, her eyes warm and gentle. "By remembering how it felt to be small," she said with a smile, "and deciding never to make anyone feel that way again." The crowd around them fell silent, and for a moment even the cameras stopped clicking. It was a sentence that carried the heart of her journey, from humiliation to honor, from mockery to meaning. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zanele visited her mother's grave. She placed a single golden flower on the stone and whispered, "Mama, they once laughed at my shoes, but they led me here." Her voice trembled slightly, not with sadness but with gratitude. As she stood, the camera caught her walking away. The same woman who once stood outside a ballroom in tears, now walking confidently through a world she rebuilt. The narrator's voice rose softly over the fading scene. They mocked her shoes, but she was walking her destiny. Because sometimes the road to greatness begins in worn-out stalls and ends in a limousine. It wasn't just her victory. It was every woman's reminder that grace, when paired with strength, can rebuild entire worlds.